Hello there. Today, I'd like to take you on an ASMR adventure into the home of one of the world's most famous novelists, Charles Dickens. The Charles Dickens Museum in London is situated at 48 Doughty Street, where Dickens once lived with his family. It provides a fascinating glimpse into the domestic life of this popular writer. So, in this talk, I'm going to guide you through his former home, room by room, and describe some of the many interesting things you can see there. As usual, there'll be a slideshow of photographs to accompany our tour, but there's no need to look at them if you don't want to. If you prefer, you can just close your eyes and relax, and let my voice guide you. So, welcome to the Charles Dickens Museum. Before we go in, let's take a moment to stand outside and look at the museum building. Number 48 is part of a terrace of elegant brick-built houses that were erected in the Georgian era at the end of the 18th century. Today, the buildings on Doughty Street are mainly given over to businesses and offices, but in the 19th century, this was an affluent residential road. Dickens moved to number 48 in 1837 when he was just 25 years old. He had recently married Catherine Hogarth, the daughter of a prominent newspaper editor, and Dickens was working as a journalist, as well as beginning to develop his career as an author. He was already working on his first novel, The Pickwick Papers, which was being published in installments and was proving to be very popular. 48 Doughty Street was the perfect address for a rising young couple who wanted a smart house where they could entertain their literary friends, but who were also looking to create a comfortable family home. Let's enter that home now, not by walking in through the front door of number 48, but instead by entering number 49, the house next door, which is also now part of the Dickens Museum. We'll begin by stepping into the hallway and then turning left into the little museum shop. If you were actually visiting the museum, you would buy your entrance ticket here, but as you're on this special tour with me, we can pass straight through the shop to another door on the far side of the room and walk into number 48, Charles Dickens' house. Let's start by exploring the dining room, which is a graceful room at the front of the house, with walls that are painted in a rich shade of blue and contrasting white woodwork. 2 tall sash windows look out over the street, and at the centre of the room, a large dining table is laid as though in preparation for a dinner party. Charles and Catherine Dickens loved to entertain at their new house and frequently invited friends here for dinner. Many of those friends were, like Dickens himself, rising figures in the cultural world, and they've been represented in this room rather charmingly, with a special blue and white dinner service that is laid out on the table. The edge of each white dinner plate features a pretty border of blue flowers, in the traditional style of the early Victorian era. However, at the centre of each plate is a portrait of one of Dickens' famous dinner guests. William Makepeace Thackeray, the author of Vanity Fair, is represented on one plate, while William Macready, the famous actor-manager, is depicted on another. Other plates are dedicated to the artist Daniel Maclise, whose portrait of Catherine Dickens we'll see in the next room, and to the journalist John Forster, who was a particular friend of Charles Dickens and who would later go on to write his biography. Seeing all these names around the dinner table creates a lively sense of the intellectual and artistic hub that Dickens created for himself in this house. There must have been many convivial and interesting conversations held in this room. However, if we walk next door into the morning room, we'll discover a more intimate atmosphere and a greater sense of the Dickens' private home life. Shortly before moving to Doughty Street, Catherine Dickens had given birth to Charlie, the couple's first child, and she would go on to have 2 more children whilst living here. This morning room was her domain, a family room where she could play with her children, attend to her needlework, run the household, supervise her servants, and answer her correspondence. The room has been decorated with a pretty pale blue wallpaper featuring a leafy white stripe, and above the fireplace, over the white painted mantelpiece, is a pair of pastel portraits of Charles and Catherine Dickens. These were drawn by the artist Samuel Lawrence in 1838, and on the adjacent wall there's another painting of Catherine, this time by Daniel Maclise. It shows her sitting in an ivy green dress, attending to a piece of needlework, and in a rather lovely touch, the museum curator has placed a glass case underneath the portrait, which contains not only a piece of Catherine's actual needlework, but also the same ring that she's wearing in the painting. On the opposite side of the room, a single sash window looks out over the courtyard garden at the back of the house, and in front of this window is a desk, fitted with another display cabinet, where you can see the Dickens' marriage certificate. There are also copies of Charles and Catherine's early correspondence with each other, which reveals how affectionate and happy the couple were at this early stage of their marriage. Turning back out of the morning room, let's walk down a plain wooden staircase that will lead us down into the basement of the house and into the realm of the household servants. In the 1830s, electric power was still yet to be invented, and the London sewers were yet to be built, so it was essential for a couple with any pretensions to gentility to employ domestic staff. The Dickens household included a child's nursemaid and a cook, as well as a variety of tweenies, or between maids. These were girls who were employed from the nearby orphanage to assist the cook in the kitchen and, more importantly, to do the heavy household work of washing and cleaning. As we peer into the small scullery room and the wash-house next door, which both have bare tiled floors and very basic facilities, we can gain a sense of how hard that work must have been for the tweeny girls. Charles Dickens was not an unsympathetic master. His own grandparents had been household servants, and throughout his life he pressed for social reform, using his writing to highlight the plight of the poor and the harshness of life for working-class people. Nevertheless, his own reputation as a smart and convivial host was dependent on the hard work of his servants. The beautiful white linen cloths and napkins that graced his dining room table would only remain that way because a tweenie had spent hours fetching and boiling water, scrubbing out stains, washing, wringing, starching, and ironing that linen after the last dinner party. The house cook was also kept busy by the Dickens' frequent dinner parties, and directly underneath the dining room we can find the kitchen. This is a large and airy room with whitewashed walls and windows overlooking the basement area yard at the front of the house. The room is laid out very much as a typical kitchen would have been in an early Victorian townhouse, with a painted dresser standing against one wall and a large, black-leaded range fireplace on the opposite wall, which would have been used to do all the cooking. In the middle of the room is a scrubbed wooden table, which has been set out with a selection of dishes appropriate to the Dickens era, including homemade pies and loaves of bread. It's worth noting here that Charles Dickens was not the only member of the family to have his writing published. In 1850, under the amusing pen name of Lady Maria Clutterbuck, Catherine Dickens published a volume of suggested menu plans and culinary advice, entitled "What Shall We Have for Dinner?" No doubt her years of overseeing so many dinner parties had made her an expert in the art of entertaining, but she couldn't have achieved her success without the help of a trusted and talented cook. Let's retrace our steps now, back up the wooden staircase to the ground floor, and walk along the hallway, which features a display of Dickens' belongings. These include a wall clock, a leather bag, and a glass case containing his wallet, coin purse, and a monogrammed silver nutmeg box. In a rather fun touch, there's also a silhouette of Dickens painted on the hallway wall, with his arm outstretched to point the way up the stairs. Let's follow his lead and climb the staircase, which is covered with a strikingly patterned blue and green carpet, up to the first floor. The first room we'll enter on this floor is the drawing room. This is a large room, decorated with striped wallpaper, a floral patterned carpet, and scarlet window curtains. In here, Charles and Catherine would entertain their friends after dinner, often with music, and an elegant pianoforte dating from the 1830s sits against the wall by the entrance to the room. In this era, all young ladies from good homes were expected to have a degree of musical accomplishment so that they could entertain their family and friends, and Catherine Dickens was said to be a talented pianist. However, her husband also undertook to entertain his friends in a rather unique way, by reading aloud to them from his own work. Dickens had a passion for the theatre, and his flair as a performer would develop, later in life, into a lucrative professional practice, as he toured across America with a one-man show of readings from his novels. His friend, the author Thomas Carlyle, described Dickens as carrying an entire theatrical company under one hat, and Dickens' enthusiasm even extended to designing his own public reading desk. This was created as a tall table with narrow legs that would hold Dickens' script conveniently close to hand, while still allowing his audiences to see as much of his body movement as possible. You can see this reading desk, with its theatrically fringed red velvet cover, in a display case opposite the drawing room windows, and next to it is the original sketch that Dickens made for its design. On the other side of the room, by a window, there's another piece of furniture that was once beloved by Dickens, a high-backed armchair upholstered in wine-coloured leather. Dickens brought this chair with him to Doughty Street from his previous bachelor lodgings, and he would sit in it for the portrait that was taken of him by the artist George Cruikshank. Cruikshank also created the illustrations for Dickens' novel Oliver Twist, and if we walk through a painted white door in the corner of the drawing room, we'll find ourselves in the very place where that famous work was written. This is Dickens' study, a long rectangular room with walls painted in a deep shade of red and a large desk sitting against one wall. This desk, and the chair that goes with it, both belonged to Dickens, and it was here that he would sit down to write Great Expectations, although not until much later in his life, after he'd moved out of London to Kent. However, to the left of the desk, in a display case that's fitted into a tall mahogany bookcase, we can see early, handwritten drafts of two novels that Dickens did write in this room, Oliver Twist and Nicholas Nickleby. Dickens was incredibly prolific while he lived here, and came to this room every morning to write, often working on 2 novels at a time. By 1839, when the family left Doughty Street in order to move into a much grander house, Dickens was firmly established as a successful and prosperous author. It's easy to see this time at Doughty Street as a golden era in Charles Dickens' life. Although still a young man, he was happily married, rapidly rising in his career, and continually surrounded by friends and admirers. Yet life at Doughty Street also contained tragedy, as we'll discover when we leave the study and walk up the next flight of stairs to the 2nd floor, where we'll enter Mary Hogarth's room. This is a bedroom named after Catherine Dickens' sister Mary, who moved into 48 Doughty Street with the young couple to be a companion to her sister. The room contains a pretty single 4-poster bed, canopied in pale pink satin, and laid out on top of the bed is a white nightdress that once belonged to Mary. The two sisters were said to be very close, but in May 1837, Mary died very suddenly of what appears to have been heart failure. Catherine was devastated by the loss of her sister, but Charles Dickens was equally shattered, telling Catherine that she would need to be strong for both of them. He continued to mourn intensely for Mary, even to the point of telling Catherine that, when his own death came, he wanted to be buried with his sister-in-law. Dickens' grief for Mary would be worked into several of his novels through the deaths of innocent young characters such as Rose in Oliver Twist, Kate in Nicholas Nickleby, and later on, Little Nell in The Old Curiosity Shop. However, while Dickens fell into the habit of eulogizing these almost saint-like young girls in his books, his understanding of real women and their troubles seems to have been somewhat lacking. His grief for Mary seems to have totally overshadowed his wife's distress at the death of her own sister, and perhaps this self-preoccupation gives us a glimpse of the first crack in the Dickens' hitherto happy marriage. In later years, after the couple left Doughty Street, that crack was to widen further, until, at the age of 45, Dickens demanded a separation from his wife. He had met a young actress called Ellen Ternan, who, at 18 years old, was only slightly older than his eldest daughter. Nevertheless, Dickens became infatuated with her, and after 22 years of marriage and 10 children together, he ordered Catherine to leave the family home. She did, moving out into a little house with her eldest son Charlie, and from that point on, she was effectively written out of the rest of her famous husband's life. The knowledge of what would happen to the Dickens' marriage becomes more poignant when we walk into the next room, which was their bedroom. There's no sign of estrangement here. At this early stage of their life together, the couple was still very happy to share a room, and it's dominated by a double 4-poster bed covered with a handsome wine-coloured counterpane. There are 2 sash windows looking out over the leafy trees of the street outside, and the walls are decorated with a cheerful yellow and white floral wallpaper. Not much of the furniture in this room actually belonged to Dickens, but opposite the bed is a large, mahogany-framed swing mirror, which was once owned by the author. It's said that Dickens relied on his mirror for practicing his public speaking, and that he would stand in front of it, rehearsing the many characters he would play from his own novels during his one-man shows. Dickens' taste for showmanship was also apparent in his personal dress. He was known to wear flamboyantly patterned waistcoats and jewellery, and the journalist Charles Mackay accused him of being a dandy, which, by the 1830s, had become a rather pejorative term, to describe a gentleman who was overly concerned with fashion and grooming. In a little room that leads off the bedroom, we can find examples of Dickens' personal grooming paraphernalia in a tiny little chamber known as the dressing room. This small space was set aside for Dickens' private use, and it contains several of his personal effects, such as a lace handkerchief, a set of razors, and 2 scent bottles. Also on display is a rather fine court suit, an outfit that Dickens wore to attend a royal reception hosted by Edward, the Prince of Wales. Made of hand-stitched wool, it features a black silk lining and large gilt buttons, and was made for Dickens by the Piccadilly tailors C. Smith and Sons. Let's climb the stairs for the last time now and visit the top floor of the house, which, in the Dickens' time, was the domain of their children and the servants. To the right-hand side of the staircase is a small room on the back of the house, which would once have been a servant's bedroom. Now furnished with a simple wooden bed and washstand, the room has been imaginatively refurbished as a showcase for the work of Dickens, and a number of quotations from his most famous novels have been stencilled directly onto the walls. Next door is the nursery, which is the last room we will see in number 48. It contains a traditional Victorian iron bedstead, a red velvet nursing chair, a wooden crib, and a rather charming paper theatre, which is an example of the type of toys that Dickens' children would have played with. However, there are also some intriguing historical artifacts on display in this room that are associated with Dickens' family life, and the most striking of these is a barred window grille from Marshalsea, the notorious debtors' prison. When Dickens was 12 years old, his father was imprisoned for debt in Marshalsea, and, as was common practice at the time, his wife and most of his children accompanied him there and lived actually at the prison. However, little Charles Dickens was separated from the rest of his family and sent to work at a blacking warehouse, which was a factory that made boot polish. Dickens was miserable during this time, and later in life he would use this traumatic event, just as he did with Mary Hogarth's death, as material for his novels. Several of his books, including David Copperfield, Nicholas Nickleby and Oliver Twist, feature young boys who are abandoned by their families and are forced to undertake menial labour in order to survive. Dickens also used Marshalsea Prison in his work, and it features in both the Pickwick Papers and Little Dorrit. While the nursery is the last room to visit in Charles Dickens' actual house, there's still plenty left to see in the museum, because in 2012 the building was refurbished and a new exhibition space was added at number 49 Doughty Street, the house next door. So, returning to the second floor now, let's walk through a connecting door into number 49 and see the exhibition on display. The exhibitions change regularly, although they are always related to some aspect of Dickens' life or his work. But there is one rather extraordinary permanent exhibit on show that's worth seeking out. This is a large and rather muscular golden arm, which is mounted high up on the wall. The hand of the arm is holding up a hammer as though it's about to strike something, and this unusual object is known as the Gold-Beater's arm. Originally, it was a shop sign that hung in Rose Street in Soho, and Dickens described it in his novel The Tale of Two Cities, where it hangs outside the home of the character Dr. Manette. It's a mark of Dickens' popularity that, in 1895, Rose Street was renamed Manette Street, and if you walk along there today, you can still see a replica of the Gold-Beater's arm mounted up on the wall, although the original remains here, safe in the museum. The special exhibition rooms lead us down through the building and back to the hallway of number 49, where our visit began. You might want to pop back into the shop before you leave, because there are many interesting Dickens-related books and gifts in there. Or you might want to pause and take some refreshment in the tranquil little cafe at the back of the museum, which, in the summertime, opens up into the lovely little courtyard that was once the Dickens' garden. I'll put a link for the Dickens Museum in the description below the video, in case you'd like to visit it for yourself at some point in the future. I hope you've enjoyed exploring the home of this famous author with me, and I hope too that you can join me again soon for another relaxing ASMR adventure. Until then, thank you for your company. Goodbye.